The first hiss was sharp enough to cut through the summer heat. It rose from beneath the hood of the Valkyrie X9, a sound like steam escaping from a punctured lung. Blue-gray smoke curled against the glass towers above, drifting into the sticky August air. People slowed, drawn by the sight of wealth stranded in the wrong part of town. Phones tilted upward. Someone whispered a name, and the ripple of recognition spread fast. Evan Mercer stood at the center of it, a billionaire founder used to solving other people's impossible problems, and yet powerless before his own machine. His crisp navy suit clung damply to his back, his jaw locked in frustration as he paced tight circles beside the car. The Valkyrie was more than a hypercar. It was a statement, one of only 15 ever made, a symbol of control, precision, untouchable power. Control was slipping now. He barked into his phone again. "Yes, I need immediate dispatch. No, I do not care what the schedule says. Hello?" The call dropped. Dead zone. A figure watched him from the curb, leaning lightly against the sun-bleached wall of an abandoned warehouse. Tall, thin, shoulders squared despite the faded jacket clinging to his frame. He was motionless except for his eyes, which followed the smoke the way a hunter tracks blood. His name was Elijah Ward, though few remembered it anymore. To most who passed him on these streets, he was another man stripped down to circumstance, a weathered face, a frayed collar, boots beaten soft by miles walked nowhere. But right now, Elijah was listening. The rhythm of the Valkyrie's stabilizers was wrong. Beneath the smooth synthetic hum, there was a knock, faint but constant, out of sync with the rest. To anyone else, meaningless. To him, it was the sound of pressure collapsing, seconds dripping away. Evan Mercer turned sharply when Elijah stepped forward, narrowing the gap between them by 3 paces. The billionaire's voice cracked through the air like glass. "Back away from the car." Elijah stopped where he stood. The weight of the crowd pressed in, phone lenses pointed like quiet weapons. His palms hung loose at his sides, no threat in his posture, but there was a stillness in him that did not belong to the streets. "You are losing containment pressure," Elijah said softly, his tone steady but stripped of deference. "You have 40 minutes before the core locks up permanently." Evan blinked, caught between confusion and irritation. His eyes swept over Elijah's worn jacket, his weathered face, his thrift store shoes. The judgment landed fast and reflexive. "And you would know that how?" Elijah tilted his head, studying him for a long beat, as though deciding how much truth this man deserved. "Because I built the first Valkyrie prototype." A laugh broke in the crowd, sharp, nervous, disbelief trying to disguise itself. Someone muttered, "Yeah, sure." A younger man in designer sneakers snorted without looking up from his phone. Evan's mouth curled faintly, half smirk, half scorn. "Right," he said flatly. "And I suppose you also built the moon." Elijah did not answer. Instead, he pointed to the faint coil of smoke above the hood. "That shade means your secondary coolant is leaking into the tertiary chamber. The fracture sits under the actuator housing. By now, your thrust bearings are running 11 degrees hotter than spec." Evan's frown deepened. He glanced involuntarily at the diagnostics on his wrist display. Thrust bearings, secondary loop, overheating by 10.8 degrees. That was not public data. "How the hell do you know that?" he demanded. Elijah's gaze remained calm, unreadable. "Because I warned them 5 years ago this would happen. The engineers ignored it. You bought the problem." The murmurs in the crowd shifted, restless now, skeptical but uncertain. The narrative had cracked, and silence grew inside it. "Sir," Evan said, dropping his voice but sharpening its edge, "this vehicle contains proprietary systems classified by federal compliance. I do not know who sent you, but I am telling you now, step away." "You called the factory?" Elijah asked instead. "I called everyone," Evan snapped. "Authorized teams, specialists, People who actually know what they are doing. They cannot fix this, Elijah said. Not here. Not today. The words hung heavy between them, quiet but immovable. Evan glanced at his wrist display again. 38 minutes until automatic shutdown. His jaw tightened. He had no time for delusion dressed as authority. Before he could speak, Elijah added, "The patch will hold 20 days if applied correctly, 30 if you drive at reduced output." There was something in his voice, flat, precise, measured, that sounded nothing like desperation and everything like certainty. Evan hesitated, just long enough for doubt to splinter into his posture. He gestured toward his security detail, who had finally pushed through the crowd. A tall man in black approached, hand resting near his concealed holster. "Mr. Mercer, we need to move you back." His eyes landed on Elijah with the kind of look that weighs threat before dignity. "This man's leaving," Evan ordered. Elijah did not move. He gestured with a small tilt of his chin toward the engine. "That hiss? That is your pressure regulator failing. When it goes, the cascade takes the entire drive core with it. $3 million gone in 19 minutes. 18 now." The security guard's gaze flicked uneasily toward the car. Someone in the crowd whispered, "He sounds like he knows what he's talking about." Evan heard it. He hated that he heard it. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but his fingers tapped against his thigh, an unconscious tell of doubt. Elijah stepped forward, not closer to Evan, but closer to the car. His movements were slow, deliberate, designed not to trigger panic. He crouched near the hood without touching it, his head angling toward the faint plume of smoke. "Tell me what you need," Evan said finally, the words quieter than before, grudging but inevitable. Elijah stood and met his eyes evenly. "Your emergency kit, 20 uninterrupted minutes, and 2 pencils." The crowd stirred at that, uncertain if they had misheard. Evan stared. "Pencils." "Yes." Elijah's expression did not shift. "Carbon graphite, 8B density. A convenience store sells them across the street." Evan hesitated, weighing the absurdity against the growing roar of silence around him. His wrist display chimed. 34 minutes remaining. Without breaking eye contact, he signaled to one of his security men. "Go." The guard disappeared into the street, boots striking pavement with urgent rhythm. Elijah turned his attention back to the machine, hands clasped loosely behind his back. There was reverence in the way he studied it, not for its value, but for its design, the fragile elegance beneath its arrogance. Evan watched him, arms crossed, chest tight with resistance he could no longer fully sustain. He hated the shape of this moment, the reversal, the crowd, the possibility that his control had never been his at all. Somewhere behind them, a siren wailed faintly, and the smoke thinned in the hot wind before curling higher again, almost beautiful against the August sky. Evan followed Elijah's gaze, unsettled by the stillness in the man's posture. For the first time, something other than dismissal edged into his voice. "Who are you?" Elijah did not look at him. "Someone you stopped looking for," he said quietly. And with that, the weight of the moment shifted. Not yet trust, not yet recognition, but the first splinter in the wall between them. The graphite pencils arrived in a thin paper bag, damp from the clerk's hurried hands. Elijah took them without a word, his fingers brushing the cardboard sleeve, weighing the cores as if testing their density by memory. Around him, the crowd had thickened, their murmurs reduced to restless quiet. The air was heavy, humid, full of heat and anticipation. Evan Mercer stood a few feet away, his phone forgotten, arms crossed tight over his chest. His security detail lingered at his shoulders, tension coiled like a loaded spring. Every instinct told him this was wrong. Wrong to allow an unvetted stranger near proprietary technology worth more than most buildings on the block. And yet, here he was, watching Elijah as though pulled into his gravity against his will. "You have 19 minutes," Evan said flatly. Elijah glanced at him briefly, then at the car. "I will only need 17. The words carried no arrogance. They landed with the weight of fact. He crouched low beside the Valkyrie's hood and carefully removed a single tool from the emergency kit, a thin torque driver designed for modular access panels. Each movement was deliberate, economical. His shoulders were loose, his breathing steady, the opposite of the panic twisting through the crowd. Evan studied him, unsettled by the quiet precision. The man's hands bore the marks of work, calluses layered like tree rings, old scars where sharp edges had bitten deep. They were not the hands of someone bluffing his way into brilliance. "Why are you on the street?" Evan asked suddenly. The question slipped out sharper than he intended, an accusation disguised as curiosity. Elijah did not look up. "Because systems fail," he said softly, loosening the panel with a controlled twist. "Sometimes faster than engines." It was not an answer, and yet it landed like one. The first panel came free with a muted click. A faint hiss escaped, followed by a thread of heat against Elijah's wrist. He leaned closer, scanning the exposed chamber without touching a thing. His eyes tracked patterns invisible to anyone else, the faint silver residue along the inner seal, the distorted shimmer of coolant where it should have been clear. "Exactly where I said," he murmured. Evan moved instinctively closer, stopping short when one of his security guards shifted forward. Elijah glanced at the guard briefly, his gaze cool, detached, as though calculating probabilities no one else could see. "You brought a problem to market before it was solved," Elijah said quietly. "They ignored the thermal tolerances, pushed the coolant mix too far. Now the system eats itself from the inside." Evan bristled at the words, but he could not deny them. The warning logs he had dismissed over the years resurfaced like ghosts in his memory. From the far edge of the crowd, a teenager with a cracked phone whispered to his friend, "Who is this guy?" Elijah heard it, though his hands never stopped moving. He slid the graphite stick from its casing, shaved it with the driver's edge until it exposed a clean core, then combined it with a measured squeeze of emergency sealant. The two materials bled together into a shimmering gray paste, thickening in the small glass dish he had improvised from the kit's coolant vial. Evan finally stepped forward. "You are fixing a $10 million prototype with a pencil?" Elijah's gaze flicked up, unblinking. "I am fixing a flaw with what it always needed," he said simply. "Carbon, stable at 1,800 degrees, conductive enough to carry charge without destabilizing the bearings." The words were clinical, stripped of theatrics. The crowd, silent now, hung on every syllable. "You act like you designed this system," Evan said. Elijah smoothed the mixture against the microfracture, his voice low and even. "I did." Evan froze, not entirely believing, not entirely disbelieving. "Name," he said finally. "Elijah Ward." The name stirred nothing in Evan at first, but in the back of his mind, something faint shifted, like a book cracked open to an unread page. Years ago, early drafts of Valkyrie design memos, signatures buried in legal contracts. The sensation was disquieting, like recognizing a ghost without knowing why. Elijah secured the seal, his movements fluid and exact. A small tendril of smoke curled upward, then vanished as the mixture hardened instantly under heat. He waited 5 seconds, listening, not watching, but listening, to the subtle rhythm of pressure equalizing within the chamber. "Stabilizing," he said finally. "You are not touching the ignition," Evan warned. "No," Elijah said softly. "You are." The command in his voice was quiet, but it held the authority of someone who had known this machine long before Evan ever bought it. Evan hesitated, his thumb hovering over the biometric starter pad. He hated the imbalance, the reversal of power, the reliance on a man he had dismissed moments earlier, But his investors were waiting 3 miles away, and the Valkyrie was his weapon. "Do it," Elijah said again, softer now. Evan pressed his thumb to the glass. The Valkyrie woke with a low, resonant hum, a sound too precise to be anything but deliberate. The stabilizer's whine leveled, the temperature readouts on the wrist display sliding steadily downward. The engine's rhythm returned to perfect symmetry. The crowd erupted, not with noise exactly, but with a ripple of awe that sounded almost like belief breaking loose for the first time. Evan stood still, staring at the numbers. 37 minutes to meltdown. Now stable. No leak detected. Performance capped at 70%, but holding. "That is impossible," he whispered. "It was inevitable," Elijah corrected softly. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then the security guard's earpiece crackled, snapping the tension. "Sir," he said to Evan, lowering his voice. "Tech Directorate Security is en route. Reports flagged Valkyrie telemetry failure. 2 SUVs inbound." Evan stiffened. That changed everything. Directorate Security had clearance to seize any Valkyrie system classified under export protocols. If they arrived and found unauthorized access, the car would be impounded. So would the footage. So would Elijah. "They cannot find you here," Evan said suddenly. Elijah finally looked at him, his gaze steady. "I warned them 5 years ago. They buried my warnings. Let them come." Evan's throat tightened. For reasons he could not explain, that answer unsettled him more than the arrival of armed security. From the south end of the street, the hum of approaching engines rose faintly above the crowd's chatter. 2 black SUVs turned the corner, glossy paint flashing sunlight, moving like predators through a herd. Evan stepped closer to Elijah, his voice low now. "Walk away. Right now." Elijah wiped his hands on a rag from the kit, slow and deliberate. He pocketed the graphite sleeve, leaving the rest behind. "I already tried walking away," he said. The meaning hung unspoken, heavy and sharp. The SUVs stopped at the curb. Uniformed officers spilled out, scanning the scene with mirrored lenses. One raised a palm to Evan. "Mr. Mercer, step aside. We have reports of unauthorized interference with classified systems." The crowd scattered back, tension breaking like glass. Evan looked at Elijah one last time, caught between choices he did not yet understand, his voice almost swallowed by the chaos. "What are you?" Elijah finally met his gaze, calm beneath the noise, beneath the mirrored lenses, beneath the threat pressing closer. "The one they tried to erase," he said quietly. And the SUVs closed in. The black SUVs idled at the curb, their engines a low, predatory growl beneath the static hum of summer heat. Directorate Security moved as one unit, 12 men and women in matte gray uniforms, mirrored visors hiding their eyes. Their boots struck pavement in perfect cadence, a rhythm built to unsettle. The crowd had pulled back instinctively, gathering in the shadows of doorways and leaning balconies, their phones still raised but hands trembling just slightly now. Elijah Ward stood where he was, still and quiet, his palms resting loosely at his sides. His breathing was even, his face unreadable. To anyone watching, he looked unconcerned, but beneath the surface 1,000 calculations were moving at once. Pressure, time, angles, the inevitability of confrontation pressing closer with every footstep. The lead officer stopped 3 paces from him, her visor reflecting Elijah's worn jacket and soot-streaked boots back at him like a distorted mirror. Her voice came sharp, amplified through the small throat mic strapped beneath her jaw. "Step away from the vehicle, now." Evan Mercer moved quickly, intercepting before Elijah could respond. "This is my car," he said, his voice measured, deliberate, projecting the weight of his name like a shield. "Helix Dynamics authorized purchase, private ownership, non-export designation." The officer turned her mirrored faceplate toward him. "Mr. Mercer," she said, flat but firm. Telemetry data flagged an unregistered breach into a proprietary system. Your Valkyrie's cooling grid tripped Directorate protocols. We are authorized to secure the vehicle and any individuals involved in its modification until cleared. Evan hesitated. This was no longer about his hypercar. The Directorate owned the patents beneath the skin of this machine, and they had the authority to treat tampering like sabotage. He glanced back at Elijah. The man had not moved. The officer gestured, and two agents stepped forward, scanning Elijah from boots to shoulders. One carried a portable bioreader. Its green status light pulsed like a heartbeat in the shadows. "Identification," she said. Elijah's silence stretched until the crowd felt it. Finally, his voice came low, steady, and stripped of anything that sounded like submission. "You do not want to run my name." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. The officer's visor tilted slightly, as though recalculating her assessment. "And why is that?" "Because your system will light red before the scan completes," Elijah said, his tone flat, almost bored. "And then you will not know whether to arrest me or call your supervisor." The agents glanced at each other, then at their commander. Evan stared at him now, torn between disbelief and curiosity clawing at the edges of reason. "Who the hell are you?" he whispered, too low for the crowd but not low enough for Elijah to miss. Elijah did not answer. The lead officer stepped closer. "Sir," she said, her tone sharpening, "place your hands where I can see them." Something shifted in Elijah's eyes then. Not fear, not resistance, but something older, colder, buried deep. He raised his hands slowly, deliberately, as though reminding everyone in earshot that it was his choice, not theirs. The bioreader chirped once, bright and sharp. Its display flickered, cycling through data too quickly to read. Then it stopped. Red. The silence that followed was heavier than the summer heat. One of the younger agents swore softly under his breath. The lead officer tapped her comm, switching frequencies. "Command, this is Lancer 2. We have a ward designation at location Delta 67. Confirm status?" Static hissed in her earpiece. The answer came 6 seconds later, the voice on the other end clipped, urgent. "Do not engage. Hold position and wait for command override." The officer froze. That was not protocol. Evan's gaze snapped between them. "Ward designation?" he asked, louder than he intended. Elijah lowered his hands, calm as if the heat had lifted from his skin. 5 years ago, he said quietly, his voice just enough to carry, "I told them the Valkyrie engines were unstable. I filed 200 pages of warnings. They buried them. My name became a liability, so they made it disappear." He looked at Evan then, finally, and for the first time there was something raw beneath his composure. "And now they want to decide whether I am a threat or an embarrassment." Evan tried to process the words, but the officer's voice cut through the silence again. "Mr. Mercer," she said, low and deliberate now, "step away from this man. Whatever you think you know about him, it is not the truth." "I am beginning to suspect that," Evan said under his breath. The whine of the Valkyrie's cooling stabilizers broke the tension briefly, its repaired systems humming smoothly now under Elijah's improvised patch. The irony was unspoken but undeniable. The man the Directorate once erased had just saved the very technology they were trying to protect. A single drone descended from one of the SUVs, rotors buzzing softly as its targeting sensors scanned Elijah's posture. Its lens fixed on his chest, a silent confirmation of authority. The crowd shifted uneasily, murmurs swelling like a low tide. Some people started recording openly, their cameras tilted to capture Elijah, the agents, and Evan standing between them. Elijah exhaled slowly and turned his head, scanning the rooftops above them, gauging shadows, exits, timing. His voice when it came was almost gentle. "You have about 90 seconds before command tells them to move." Evan glanced at him, startled. "How do you know that?" "Because I used to write their response protocols," Elijah said. The words hit harder than any shouted confession. The officer stiffened. Two agents adjusted their stances, unsure whether to treat him as dangerous or invaluable. The comm unit on her shoulder crackled again, this time sharper, louder. Lancer 2, Directive Red on Ward Class designation. Secure target alive. Directive Red? One of the younger agents repeated, his voice tight with nerves. Alive, Elijah said softly. That means they do not want the headlines that come with dead geniuses. Evan stepped forward instinctively, placing himself between Elijah and the lead officer before he could think about why. This man just saved my car, my investment, my meeting, he said, his voice edged with something more defiant than reason. If you are taking him, you are taking him through me. The mirrored visor turned toward him slowly, her silence heavier than any threat. In the distance, more sirens rose, faint but growing. Elijah's gaze shifted, subtle and unreadable, to the emergency access tunnel at the far end of the street, a locked metal hatch disguised beneath a faded mural. He had spotted it minutes ago. He was calculating, deciding, waiting. The officer finally spoke. Mr. Mercer, step aside. That is an order. No, Evan said, his voice steady now, surprising even himself. Elijah looked at him for the first time without guarded detachment, something almost like recognition flickering behind his exhaustion. The drone's lens shifted, its soft whir aligning. 60 seconds left. Elijah leaned toward Evan, his voice so low only he could hear. If you stay here, you become leverage. Move when I tell you to. What are you planning? Evan whispered back. Elijah's eyes, cold and focused, held his for a beat. Not a plan, he said softly. An old contingency. The comm unit chirped again, louder now, urgent. All units, execute. The first agent reached for Elijah's wrist, and Elijah moved, fast, precise, silent. The crowd gasped as mirrored visors reflected a blur of motion, but not resistance. Elijah's hand slipped free without striking, pivoting his weight so fluidly the agent stumbled sideways into his partner. He was already 3 steps back, his jacket brushing the Valkyrie's fender, one hand closing around the emergency kit still resting open on the pavement. Mr. Ward, stop! The lead officer barked. Elijah's voice came quiet, level, unshaken. You buried me once, he said. Do not make the mistake of trying again. And before the agents could close, Elijah pivoted toward the locked access hatch, the crowd surging like a tide between him and the directorate. The last thing Evan saw was the faint glint of graphite dust still clinging to Elijah's fingertips before he disappeared into the heat and shadows. The heat of the street gave way to cold air and damp concrete. Elijah dropped into the narrow shaft and landed silently on his boots, knees bending to absorb the impact. The access tunnel beneath the industrial block stretched ahead in darkness, lined with forgotten maintenance cables and rusted piping. He paused only long enough to listen. The muffled chaos above, the bark of directorate orders, the hiss of drone rotors. But down here, sound fell strangely flat. He moved fast, threading the narrow corridor with the practiced precision of someone who had traced these schematics years ago, long before they had erased his name. His breathing stayed measured, quiet. Each step was intentional, mapping pressure points in his mind. One wrong sound, one metallic scrape, and they would find him. Behind him, the faint clang of boots struck pavement above. The directorate agents were spreading out, trying to lock down surface exits. Elijah guessed they would breach the hatch in under 2 minutes. He did not plan on being here when they did. Far above, Evan Mercer stood frozen in the thinning crowd, heart hammering against his ribs. The directorate agents had formed a loose perimeter around the Valkyrie, drones circling in a slow, deliberate pattern as they scanned the surrounding rooftops. The lead officer's visor turned toward him. Mr. Mercer, she said flatly, you have no legal obligation to stay. In fact, I strongly advise against it. But Evan's eyes stayed fixed on the hatch Elijah had vanished through, the metal now locked from the inside. "What happens if you find him?" he asked quietly. "That depends on what command decides," she replied. Her tone gave nothing away, but there was a subtle weight in her pause, a shadow under the words. "Who is he?" Evan pressed, his voice low but sharp. "And why do you want him alive?" The officer tilted her head, visor catching the sunlight like glass. "Mr. Mercer," she said, softer now, "if you know what is best for you, you will walk away. Elijah Ward is not your problem." Evan's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking beneath his skin. "He fixed what none of your engineers could touch. That is precisely why he is our problem." For the first time, there was a faint crack in her composure. Evan caught it, and it unsettled him more than her authority ever could. Beneath the streets, Elijah turned sharply into an older section of the tunnel network, where the concrete walls narrowed and condensation dripped from overhead pipes. Dim orange light flickered through broken fixtures, casting fractured shadows across his path. He stopped at an intersection, crouched low, and placed his fingertips on the floor. Cool airflow brushed lightly from the left, warmer from the right. He chose the left without hesitation. The path descended into a deeper artery, one that ran beneath Helix Dynamics' southern testing labs. The irony was not lost on him. Years ago, he had walked these same tunnels carrying blueprints they had later stolen, warnings they had later ignored, reports they had later buried. He had spent months preparing for this day without knowing when, or if, it would come. At the next junction, a faint glimmer caught his attention. Embedded high in the corner wall, half hidden by shadow, a palm-sized drone hovered silently, its single lens pulsing faint red light. He froze. Old Directorate model, autonomous, thermal sweep class. They had deployed them faster than he expected. He closed his eyes briefly, replaying schematics from memory. 2 more drones likely waited in the adjoining shafts. If they detected him, his position would broadcast to every agent topside within seconds. Elijah exhaled slowly, then shifted his weight onto the arch of his foot, lowering his center of gravity until he became shadow within shadow. The drone pivoted lazily, scanning the junction in rhythmic intervals. He timed the sweep, moved between rotations, and slipped under its sensor cone without a sound. Not yet found. Not yet. Above ground, Evan's private line buzzed once, a secure channel only 3 people had access to. He stepped aside, shielding his mouth from Directorate mics. "Talk," he said under his breath. A clipped voice replied, "We reviewed archived project files per your request. Cross-referenced Valkyrie prototypes with flagged personnel." Evan's grip tightened on the phone. "And?" "Elijah Ward," the voice said, "was Chief Systems Architect for the Quantum Thrust Array 5 years ago. Classified Tier 1 clearance. He authored Memo KX-147, detailed predictions of microfracture failures under high-pressure coolant testing." Evan swallowed hard. The memo number matched the exact defect Elijah had identified moments before the Valkyrie melted itself into a paperweight. "Why did they bury it?" Evan asked quietly. The voice hesitated before replying, "Because Memo KX-147 was tied to Project Helios." Evan's jaw locked. He had heard whispers of Helios, a closed-door research program that never reached market but consumed billions in black budgets before disappearing completely. He had always assumed it was rumor. Now, it had a name. And a ghost. Before he could ask more, the voice cut off sharply. Static filled his ear. Connection terminated. When he turned back, the lead officer was watching him through her mirrored visor, as though she had heard enough to know where his thoughts were drifting. Elijah reached an old steel door at the end of the tunnel, its surface rough with corrosion, the faded remnants of a Directorate seal etched into the center. He knelt, running his fingers over the locking mechanism. Beneath the rust, beneath the damage, he could still feel the precision of his own design. He remembered the day they installed it, how he had explained redundancies the executives had waved off, how they had promised his name would never leave the walls of Helix Dynamics. Promises vanished faster than coolant under pressure. He entered the bypass sequence from memory. 2 clicks. A pause. Rotate. Press. The lock disengaged with a muted hiss, and the heavy door swung inward. Inside, a forgotten control chamber stretched into shadow, filled with dust-coated consoles and dead monitors. The room smelled faintly of machine oil and damp steel, a place sealed off long before most people remembered it existed. He crossed to the main terminal and brushed the grime from its surface. The old directorate interface blinked dimly as emergency power trickled from a dying auxiliary cell. He inserted a data key the size of a thumbnail, one he had carried inside the lining of his boot for years. Lines of encrypted code began to unlock, a quiet cascade of green across the cracked glass. Old files came alive, frozen warnings thawing into motion. He scrolled until he found it. Project Helios, KX-147, red-stamped, black-sealed. Every suppressed test, every catastrophic failure, every falsified report. And one line at the top, under author, Ward, Elijah J. Back on the surface, the lead officer's comm flared with new orders. Lancer 2, be advised, the voice crackled. Authorization override issued from command. Priority directive black on Ward. No public apprehension. Recover asset discreetly. Directive black? The officer repeated, shifting uneasily. She hesitated, glancing once at the access hatch Elijah had used, now swarming with tactical sensors feeding live telemetry to the directorate's servers. Evan caught the hesitation. What is Directive Black? He demanded. The officer turned her visor toward him but did not answer. Why are you after him? Evan pressed, louder now. Why erase him, bury his work, and then... Her voice cut sharp and final. Walk away, Mr. Mercer. But Evan did not move. He could not. Because in that moment, he understood something Elijah had not said but had been showing him from the beginning. This was not about the Valkyrie. This was about what Elijah knew. And the directorate was terrified of him. Deep beneath the city, the last line of code decrypted. Elijah's screen pulsed once, a soft flash of green acknowledgement. And then the monitors filled with cascading warnings. Project Helios. Status, compromised failure. Probability, 87% containment breach. Pending. His throat tightened, his breath sharp in the cold silence. It had been worse than even his predictions. Above him, he heard the faint metallic clang of boots on the tunnel ladder. Directorate had breached. He closed the console, pocketed the key, and melted into the darkness just as the chamber door blew open behind him. The tunnel breathed heat and silence. Elijah ran with the measured control of someone who did not waste movement. Each footfall struck the concrete lightly, absorbing shock rather than announcing it. Behind him, the muffled thud of boots drew closer, Directorate agents flooding into the network like a tide that refused to recede. The tunnels beneath the city stretched for miles, remnants of a forgotten infrastructure project. But Elijah knew their bones better than anyone. He had helped draft the original schematics when Helix Dynamics expanded its testing facilities 5 years ago. Every forgotten vent, every sealed hatch, every hidden bypass lived in his memory. But they had mapped him too. The Directorate drones hunted silently, skating along the ceilings with infrared sensors that painted the dark in invisible grids. One wrong heat signature, one breath too loud, and the network would close around him like a fist. Elijah slowed as he reached a rusted junction chamber, its walls damp with condensation. The orange emergency lights flickered faintly, casting fractured shadows across the floor. He crouched, palm flat against the cold concrete, waiting until the rhythm of the approaching boots became distinct enough to map their distance. 4 agents, 30 meters, advancing in staggered pairs. He had less than 60 seconds. On the surface, Evan Mercer stood at the center of chaos. The directorate had locked down the block, drones circling overhead in synchronized sweeps. Civilians had been pushed behind barricades, murmurs rippling through the restless crowd like low static. Evan ignored them, his gaze fixed on the sealed access hatch where Elijah had disappeared. The lead officer, Lancer 2, approached, visor still hiding her expression. "Mr. Mercer," she said, her tone clipped and cold, "your cooperation is over. This is now a controlled operation." "Controlled?" Evan repeated, his voice sharp. "You just unleashed half a strike team into a drainage network beneath my company's prototype lab. Do you want to tell me why, or should I guess?" Lancer 2 hesitated a fraction longer than protocol allowed. Evan caught it. "You know something," he said quietly. "You know who he is, what he built, why you erased him." The mirrored visor reflected him back, a distorted twin, power bent against power. "What you should know," she said finally, "is that Elijah Ward is classified as a Ward-level asset. That designation carries more weight than this street, your car, and your company combined." "Asset," Evan said, testing the word. "Not suspect, not fugitive. Asset." Lancer 2 gave no response, but silence was its own kind of confirmation. Underground, Elijah reached an old data junction embedded into the wall, its casing corroded but still functional beneath the surface. He stripped away the metal shell in 3 swift motions and connected a thin drive from his boot lining, bypassing the encrypted interface in less than 10 seconds. Green text bled across the cracked terminal, old commands resurfacing like ghosts dragged from deep water. Project Helios, Access Level Omega classified files, unsealed. Elijah scrolled through the reports, his breathing steady despite the rising pressure in his chest. Prototype failures, test logs, mortality ratios buried beneath layers of corporate obfuscation. And beneath it all, a single flagged document, Helios Core 221A, Containment Integrity Report. He opened it. The data confirmed everything he had warned them about, and worse, quantum destabilization in Valkyrie prototypes correlates directly to reactor drift in Helios-class drives. Microfracture-induced coolant breaches will trigger cascading thermal instability at field-scale tests, resulting in uncontrolled energy discharge. Field scale, not cars, not engines, reactors. Helix Dynamics had not been designing transportation. They had been building weaponized energy cores, and every Valkyrie on the street, including Evan Mercer's, ran on a miniature Helios derivative. The consequences unraveled through Elijah's mind like dominoes tipped into a void. It was not just about the directorate anymore. This was physics against arrogance, probability against pride. The boots were louder now, 20 meters. He severed the data link and pocketed the drive, already moving toward the next junction. Back above, Evan's phone buzzed, an encrypted ping from one of his analysts embedded inside Helix Dynamics. He stepped aside and opened the secured channel, shielding the screen from directorate intercepts. "Evan," the analyst whispered urgently, "we pulled the sealed archive you flagged earlier. You are not going to believe this." "Try me." Project Helios was not a propulsion project. It was classified under strategic energy containment. Quantum reactors, Evan. The Valkyrie prototypes are field-deployed shells for containment testing. Evan froze, the world narrowing around the words. "You are telling me they put Helios cores on public roads?" "They needed real-time thermal data at scale," the analyst said, voice cracking now. "Every car is a live experiment. The one Ward just saved? It should have failed catastrophically months ago." Evan's breath slowed, sharp and deliberate. The directorate's pursuit, Elijah's warnings, the deliberate burial of his name, it all aligned into something colder than conspiracy. Helix Dynamics had gambled billions, and if Elijah's warnings were right, the next failure would not just destroy a car, it would level city blocks. Elijah heard them before he saw them, the steady cadence of trained operators, the faint hum of drones gliding above. He slipped into a maintenance conduit barely wider than his shoulders, pressing himself into shadow as two agents entered the chamber below. One of them spoke quietly into their comms. "Command, negative visual. Junction Bravo 6 empty. Scanning thermals now." Elijah's jaw tightened. He could outrun sensors. He could not outrun heat. He pulled a thin foil patch from his pocket, a makeshift scatter mesh, and pressed it against his chest beneath his shirt. His body heat blurred instantly into the tunnel background. The drone swept past his hiding place, beam fanning across the corridor like a silent blade. It paused, hovered for one impossibly long second, then drifted on. When the chamber cleared, Elijah exhaled slowly, counting backward from 5 before emerging into the darkness again. He moved deeper, tracing the slope of the tunnel until it dropped into a cylindrical chamber beneath Helix's southern wing. Thick conduits ran along the walls like veins, glowing faintly where coolant still pulsed under low-pressure circulation. The hum of the Helios cores resonated through the floor. Subtle, low frequency, alive. On the surface, Lancer 2's comm erupted with static, followed by a clipped command. "Lancer 2, Ward recovered. Status update." She pressed a hand to her earpiece. "Negative visual. Tracking telemetry, but signal interference increasing." "Interference?" the voice snapped. "He wrote your network protocols. You are in his tunnels. Contain him before—" The transmission cut. Her visor turned toward Evan, who was watching her closely. "You know why you cannot let him get out," Evan said, his voice low, tight. "Because he is carrying something you buried, and I want to know what it is." The mirrored glass reflected him back in silence. "Step away, Mr. Mercer," she said finally, colder now, "or you will be classified as obstructing a federal security directive." Evan's choice crystallized in that moment, stripped of nuance. He could walk away, protect his company, protect his empire. Or he could stay in this fight with a man who minutes ago had been a stranger. For the first time in his life, Evan Mercer did not hesitate. "No," he said, "I am not walking away." In the tunnels below, Elijah reached an emergency relay chamber, one designed as a fail-safe for reactor testing, never intended for public knowledge. A reinforced hatch blocked his path, its control panel still live despite years of neglect. He keyed in an override sequence he had written half a decade ago, hands steady, voice silent. The hatch unlocked with a muted click. Beyond it, darkness waited, but so did the answers. He stepped inside, shutting the door behind him just as a directorate agent's silhouette appeared in the corridor beyond. From inside the chamber, Elijah heard the muffled metallic scrape of gloved hands forcing the hatch mechanism. His pulse stayed steady, even as the control panel in front of him lit up with a single, unblinking warning. Helios core local stability. Critical. The chamber was silent except for the faint hum of energy beneath the floor, a sound Elijah had not heard in 5 years. He stood in front of the terminal, his reflection ghosted faintly across the cracked glass. The warning pulsed on screen, unblinking, steady. Helios core, local stability. Critical. Beneath his boots, he could feel it. The faint vibration of power bleeding through the coolant network, the low-frequency resonance of a containment field pushing against its limits. It was subtle, almost inaudible, but Elijah knew the language of failure when it spoke. He crouched, sliding a hand along the underside of the console until he found the hidden panel he had built himself years ago. His fingertips traced the ridge, a memory embedded in metal. Behind him, faint echoes traveled through the tunnel, boots striking concrete, fast and disciplined. They had found him. Above ground, Evan Mercer paced the edge of the directorate perimeter, his jaw tight, one hand clutching his secure comms unit. On the other end, his Helix Dynamics board liaison spoke in clipped, carefully neutral tones. "Evan," the voice said, "walk away from this. Do not obstruct federal operations. Helios-related protocols are beyond your clearance. My clearance? Evan's voice was low but sharp, riding the edge between fury and restraint. I own the Valkyrie prototypes. I bought the patents outright. No, the liaison replied softly, almost pitying. You bought the shells. The Directorate owns the cores. For the first time, the full scale of the deception landed cleanly in Evan's chest. His wealth, his influence, the illusion of control. They had sold him half-truths wrapped in non-disclosure clauses and sealed technical gaps with lies. And Ward? Evan asked, forcing the words out. Why erase him? Silence filled the line for 3 beats before the liaison answered. Because Ward refused to approve Valkyrie integration. He flagged Helios safety tolerances as a catastrophic liability, and when Command overrode his reports, he walked. Evan frowned, jaw tightening. You destroyed him for being right. The voice on the other end lowered even further. Not destroyed. Contained. The comm went dead. Evan stared at the sealed hatch Elijah had vanished through, the edges of his control fracturing for the first time in years. He didn't realize his hands were shaking until his security chief touched his shoulder. Sir, the guard said quietly, if they take Ward, we may never hear the truth. Evan's eyes sharpened. Then we are going in. Elijah worked fast, sliding the override key from his boot and inserting it into the side console. A series of encrypted prompts surfaced on screen, cascading green through the dying display. Access. Accepted safety protocols. Overridden core telemetry. Streaming data spilled across the monitors like a flood. Temperatures spiking. Coolant pressure falling. Nanostructure degradation accelerating along the containment walls. He absorbed it in seconds, every variable slotting into a pattern that confirmed the worst. The Valkyrie cores were derivatives, but the one beneath him, the buried test engine beneath the southern wing, was the original. And it was failing. He pressed his palm flat against the glass, almost instinctively. The hum beneath the chamber deepened, vibrating up through his ribs, becoming something felt rather than heard. The longer the core drifted, the closer they came to a thermal cascade. At 42% destabilization, the field would collapse. At 43, the energy trapped inside would fight to escape. At 44, it would succeed. Above him, the door shook violently as Directorate agents forced the manual override. A steel bolt groaned under the weight of hydraulic torque. Elijah glanced up once, expression steady, voice quiet. You are late. Evan dropped through the access hatch into the tunnels, the darkness swallowing him whole. 2 of his security guards followed, weapons drawn, though Evan gave no command to fire. The heat rose with every step, a dry metallic thickness that clung to his lungs. They followed the faint vibrations, each one sharper than the last, until the corridor split into 3 paths. One of his guards checked his wrist scanner, then shook his head. Signal interference. Picking up nothing. Evan stood still, closing his eyes briefly. He thought of Elijah's voice earlier, calm under pressure, speaking in patterns of certainty where everyone else saw chaos. Evan had spent his life betting on intuition over probability, and Elijah's certainty was the closest thing to solid ground he had left. He chose the middle path. The Directorate breached the chamber door with a metallic scream, the frame twisting as hydraulics tore it open. Agents flooded in, weapons drawn, fanning into position. Elijah didn't move. He stood at the terminal, one hand still resting lightly on the console, the other hanging at his side. The cracked glass reflected them like fragments of shadow. Step away from the control panel, the lead agent ordered, voice steady but tight. Elijah's gaze slid to the agent's rifle, the faint tremor in their stance betraying nerves beneath training. Do you know what you are standing on? Elijah asked softly. The agent's visor tilted, hesitating. You are pointing weapons, Elijah continued, his voice calm, deliberate, sharp as glass. at a man holding the only instructions that will stop this entire block from ceasing to exist. That landed. The agents didn't lower their rifles, but no one advanced. The lead officer tapped her comm. "Command, we've secured Ward, but he claims containment instability on site core. Confirm?" Static filled the channel. Then Command replied sharply, "Telemetry compromised. Stand by for directive black contingency." The agents exchanged glances beneath their visors. Elijah watched their uncertainty crystallize and knew he had a small window. Above ground, alarms triggered on Directorate vehicles, their sensor rigs pulsing in overlapping red as system diagnostics synced with the Helios grid below. One of the technicians shouted, "Core drift accelerating! The field's dropping out of range!" Lancer 2 spun toward the equipment, visor catching the reflection of failing telemetry graphs. "How long?" The technician hesitated. 4 minutes before structural compromise." She swore under her breath, switching channels. "Command, confirm detonation radius." 2.3 blocks, came the reply. "Evacuate civilians now." The murmurs in the crowd spiked into panic as security teams moved to clear the perimeter. No one yet understood that the street beneath them was sitting on the edge of erasure. In the chamber, Elijah keyed a series of commands into the terminal, bypassing corrupted safety locks to reroute coolant flow from secondary reservoirs hidden 2 floors below. His movements were surgical, fingers precise, timing unforgiving. "Step back," he told the nearest agent without looking at them. The agent hesitated. "Ward, step back." His voice cut through the chamber, not loud but commanding, carrying the kind of certainty born only from knowing the cost of failure. The agent obeyed. Data flooded the monitors again. Flashing warnings colliding with emergency overrides until the system finally stabilized into a fragile, trembling balance. 42% destabilization. Still climbing. A single wrong valve, one blocked channel, and the pressure wave would shatter everything above and below. The lead agent approached cautiously. "If you can stabilize it, Command will clear you." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Command caused this." From the tunnel's far end, Evan emerged, slowing as he entered the chamber. His breath caught in the charged air, the heat pressing against his skin like an invisible hand. Elijah turned his head slightly, registering him without surprise. "You shouldn't be here," Elijah said softly. "You're welcome," Evan countered. Then Evan's gaze fell on the monitors, numbers climbing, alarms flashing, models projecting damage radii, and for the first time since this began, his composure cracked. "What happens if you fail?" he asked. Elijah did not look away from the data. "Then this city learns what Helios really is." A low vibration rolled beneath their feet, deep and resonant, as though something vast beneath the chamber had just awakened. The terminal's warning shifted to red. Helios core stability, 45%, cascade event imminent. And then the lights died. Darkness swallowed the chamber whole. For a moment there was only silence, thick and absolute. Then came the sound, faint, rhythmic, wrong, the deep metallic groan of an overpressurized system fighting itself. Elijah did not move. He knew better than to trust his eyes in the blackout. He closed them instead, letting his other senses sharpen, tuning into the subtle vibrations rippling beneath the soles of his boots. Heat licked upward through the steel grate floor, too fast, too uneven. That meant the tertiary seals had already failed. The Helios core was bleeding energy. Somewhere to his right, someone cursed under their breath. Agents shifted, visors humming faintly as backup power tried to initialize, their silhouettes sharp against the emergency strobes hidden within their armor. "Status!" barked the lead agent, her voice cutting through the dark. Static answered through her comm. Command was blind. Then came a distant, hollow boom beneath their feet. Not an explosion, but something worse. A vacuum shift, the chamber's containment envelope collapsing one layer at a time. "Elijah!" Evan's voice came from somewhere near the door. controlled but low, pulling focus without panic. Tell me we're not past recovery. Elijah's head tilted slightly, listening to the rhythm beneath the chaos. He counted silently. 1, 2, 3, matching the pulse of the coolant pumps struggling against starvation. Finally, he spoke, quiet and exact. We have 8 minutes before thermal runaway. After that, this block becomes a crater. That silenced even the directorate agents. A hiss cut the air as emergency lighting sputtered to life, bathing the chamber in a low, blood-red glow. Shadows clung to the corners, stretching long and thin across the fractured floor. Evan moved closer, scanning the array of monitors, most of which remained blank, lines of corrupted data bleeding across their surfaces like veins. 8 minutes, Evan repeated, his voice sharper now. Then tell me what we do. Elijah's hands moved without hesitation, prying open a lower console panel and yanking free a fiber cluster, stripping connections with precision born of muscle memory. You need access to the auxiliary containment valves, he said. Manual override only. There's no software left to control it. The lead agent stepped forward, raising a gloved hand. Negative. No one touches containment hardware without directorate clearance. Protocol's clear. Elijah turned his head just enough to meet her visor. His tone didn't rise, but the weight of it cut through the air. Your protocols killed the fail-safes 3 minutes ago. She hesitated, visibly torn between her training and the simple math scrawled across the dying telemetry. Evan glanced between them, his patience gone. You have 2 choices, he said coldly. Let him try, or explain to command why their containment block is rubble in 8 minutes. The agent lowered her hand. Elijah dropped to one knee, tracing his fingers along the floor until he found the recessed hatch built into the steel. He jammed his override key into the locking plate. The mechanism hesitated, then clicked, releasing a circular panel that led into the maintenance column below. A wave of heat surged upward, suffocating and metallic. Evan crouched beside him, peering into the narrow shaft. Faint light glimmered 20 feet down, reflecting off a lattice of coolant conduits now leaking thin trails of iridescent vapor. That's your access point? Evan asked. That's the heart of the problem, Elijah replied, securing a harness from the wall. The stabilizers are failing in sequence. If I cannot reset the venting pattern manually, pressure spikes will breach the Helios envelope. He glanced up once, meeting Evan's gaze with rare frankness. If I fall, seal this hatch. Do not follow me. Evan's jaw tightened. Not happening. Elijah didn't argue. He swung into the shaft, boots finding the ladder rungs by instinct, movements deliberate, controlled, every motion honed by years of engineering muscle memory no one had cared to remember. The column walls narrowed as he descended, the roar of the core swelling beneath him. Each rung vibrated with trapped energy, heat, motion, and potential disaster locked inside a machine too fragile to fail, but too flawed to last. Above, the red glow bled across the chamber, throwing fractured shadows through the open hatch. Evan leaned over, shouting into the shaft, "You said 8 minutes. How many now?" Elijah's voice floated up, steady but strained. 5. Evan turned sharply toward the directorate agents, still fanned along the walls. Start evacuating civilians in a 3-block radius, he ordered. One of the agents hesitated. That's not protocol. It is now. No one argued. Halfway down the shaft, Elijah reached the auxiliary platform, bracing himself against the curved frame of the access hub. The panel before him was warped from heat, the surface blistered beneath his fingertips. He pried it open with a broken length of composite tubing, exposing a tangled cluster of coolant valves and quantum pressure regulators glowing faintly under stress. The lines were wrong. Reversed polarity in 2 circuits, a deliberate bypass in a 3rd. He froze. Someone had sabotaged the containment grid. That changed everything. Above him, Evan's voice came faintly. Talk to me, Elijah. Elijah didn't answer at first, his mind racing, tracing pathways backward through design schematics burned into memory years ago. There was no reason for this configuration, not unless the directorate had repurposed Helios for something beyond propulsion research. Finally, he called back, voice low, tight. This isn't an accident. Someone rerouted the stabilizers deliberately. The agents above exchanged sharp looks, but said nothing. Evan leaned closer to the hatch. Rerouted for what? Elijah's grip tightened on the regulator housing until his knuckles went pale. For energy capture, he said at last. They are bleeding the core on purpose. Above ground, the Directorate's mobile command center lit up with cascading alarms. One technician stared at the telemetry feed in disbelief. This is impossible, she muttered, her voice cracking. Power draw on the upper network just spiked 23%. Someone is pulling Helios output into the grid. Lancer 2's voice cut like steel. From where? The tech swallowed hard. A restricted node in Helix's private network, flagged under Mercer's personal authorization. The room froze. That is not possible, Lancer 2 snapped. But the logs did not lie. Down in the maintenance shaft, Elijah twisted the first coolant valve hard, forcing the flow back into the secondary bypass. The pressure spike screamed through the conduits, the sound rising into a shrill metallic whine. Heat washed over him in waves, the air nearly unbreathable. He reached for the second valve, and the entire column shuddered beneath him. Above, someone shouted, "Seismic event!" But Elijah knew better. That wasn't the Earth. That was the Helios envelope fracturing under duress. Evan dropped to his knees at the hatch, leaning as far as he dared. Elijah! The engineer's voice rose just enough to be heard over the roar. 3 valves left. 40% drift. Hold your perimeter. Suddenly, the emergency strobes died again, plunging everything back into darkness. Only the faint, ghostly glow of the failing core below remained. And in the dark, a new sound joined the chaos, the unmistakable click of rifles being readied above. The Directorate agents were repositioning. Evan spun, fury breaking loose. Stand down! He's the only one keeping us alive! But the lead agent stepped forward, visor angled toward him. Mercer, she said coldly, weapon lowering into aim. Command just flagged you as a security breach. Elijah wrenched the second valve into place, sparks blooming as fractured seals resisted his grip. The heat was suffocating now, his breathing shallow and ragged. He blinked sweat from his eyes, forcing his hand toward the third, final override. Somewhere above, boots scraped against steel, voices rose, orders collided. The walls trembled. Helios screamed beneath them. Then, without warning, the core shifted pitch. A deeper, heavier resonance, a sound like the earth itself drawing breath. Elijah froze. His instincts told him the truth before the numbers confirmed it. The cascade had begun. The roar became a living thing. The Helios core screamed beneath the chamber, a sound both mechanical and primal, the howl of trapped energy pushing against failing containment. Heat blistered through the shaft walls, the steel sweating beneath Elijah's palms as he clung to the final valve. Above him, chaos erupted. Boots pounded, orders shouted, weapons raised. Somewhere, someone's voice cracked, "Mercer's flagged! He's locked out of command!" Elijah tuned it all out. Noise was irrelevant. Authority was irrelevant. Physics would not wait for debate. His knuckles whitened around the last override lever. It was fused into position, warped by heat. He needed torque, leverage, time he did not have. A hairline vibration ran through the metal beneath his fingers, the silent warning of destabilization spreading to the tertiary seals. If he failed now, Helios would implode from the inside. Above, Evan Mercer stepped into the barrel of the lead agent's rifle. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice flat but razor sharp. The agent's visor reflected his image back at him. the billionaire reduced to just another suspect under directorate jurisdiction. "Command flagged your credentials," she repeated, tone cold, measured. "You authorized an unauthorized power siphon from Helios into your private grid." Evan's jaw flexed, but his reply was steady. "I did not sign that authorization. You're chasing the wrong ghost." "Telemetry says otherwise." Evan glanced at the monitors, catching the faint flicker of a redirected power surge graphing across the corrupted display. He recognized the signature embedded in the data. It was his encryption key, spliced, cloned, and buried under someone else's scaffolding. Not a breach, a framing. "Someone rerouted this," he said, lowering his voice so only the agent could hear. "Check the packet trail. You'll find it jumping 3 nodes through your own directorate servers before it hits my network." The agent hesitated. Her rifle lowered a fraction, but her visor turned toward the second in command. The standoff hung brittle, one command away from detonating. Then the floor trembled beneath them. Down in the shaft, Elijah's harness strained against its locks as the entire maintenance column shivered. He pressed his shoulder into the override assembly and forced the lever down. It refused, the warped track grinding under tension. Heat rolled upward, baking the metal against his skin. His breath came shallow, ragged. His mind calculated faster than fear could rise. Coolant pressure in the secondary bypass at 78%, rising 2% per second. At 92%, the tertiary bearings would melt through. He had less than 90 seconds. Above, Evan shouted down into the shaft, "Elijah, where are we?" The engineer's voice carried up, steady despite the heat burning his lungs. "2 overrides engaged. Last valve locked. Containment drift 80%. 30 meters below us, the Helios envelope is fracturing." "Translation!" Elijah glanced at the coolant gauge and answered without inflection. 3 minutes before the block ceases to exist." An alarm cut across the chamber, deafening in its urgency. The emergency strobes stuttered back to life, painting the scene in pulses of crimson and shadow. In the chaos, one of the agents pulled up a live directorate overlay. "Command just authorized tactical lockdown," she said sharply, voice breaking through the roar. "If containment fails, they'll seal this block and vent the entire sector." Evan froze, registering the words. "Vent? The sector?" "That includes us," she said grimly. For the first time, Elijah faltered, his grip slipping briefly on the valve. "They'll wipe the block," he muttered, almost to himself. 3,000 civilians in the perimeter. "They do not care," Evan called down, jaw tight. "Which means we have one option. You stabilize this core, or we're ghosts." Elijah drew a long breath, letting the panic bleed out through his fingertips until nothing remained but precision. He unclipped the broken composite tool from his belt, wedging it against the lever's locked hinge. The frame screamed in protest, the torque forcing stress lines deeper into the steel. And then, from somewhere below, a new sound joined the mechanical chaos. Faint, stuttering, alien. A high-frequency oscillation vibrating up through the shaft. Elijah knew that signal intimately. He had written it into Helios's first-generation architecture. Someone had injected a remote override protocol directly into the core. His head snapped upward. "Evan!" Mercer leaned over the hatch. "Talk to me!" "Helios isn't failing on its own," Elijah shouted, fighting to be heard over the roar. "Someone's pushing the cascade!" Evan swore under his breath, turning toward the lead agent. "You hearing this?" But the agent was already scanning encrypted directorate channels, her jaw tightening under the visor. A string of silent commands crossed her display. Top priority executive clearance. Whoever triggered the override was inside directorate command itself. Elijah braced, planted his boots against the shaft wall, and drove his entire weight into the composite tool. The lever shrieked and gave way, slamming into place with a bone-deep vibration that shuddered up his arm. For an instant, nothing happened. Then the coolant pressure gauge dropped. 90%, 75, 62. The bypass locks engaged with a satisfying thunk as containment valves redirected flow into the reserve chambers. The chamber exhaled. Heat lessened fractionally, the roar fading into a subdued, volatile hum. Elijah sagged against the ladder, chest heaving, every muscle burning. Above him, Evan saw the red strobes slow to amber, the warning thresholds stabilizing on the primary readout. The lead agent's rifle lowered fully this time. The tension began to ease, until the secondary monitors lit up with something worse. "Mercer," one agent whispered, pale behind his visor. "Someone just pulled Helios off the local grid." Evan frowned, stepping closer. Define pulled. "They're rerouting energy output to an off-site node, not ours." Elijah climbed out of the shaft, sweat streaking grime across his face. His gaze locked on the holographic projection blooming above the console, tracing the power siphon across buried pathways and hidden servers. He recognized the architecture instantly. "That's not industrial theft," Elijah said quietly. "That's a weapons protocol." A stunned silence fell across the chamber. "Helios isn't powering propulsion anymore," he continued, his voice hollow. "They built it to weaponize quantum destabilization." The Directorate agents exchanged muted glances, silent confirmation passing in fragments. Most of them had known, or suspected, but none had expected Elijah to uncover it this fast. Evan stepped between Elijah and the agents, his voice cold steel now. "You've been testing this on a live urban grid?" The lead agent's visor turned slightly, unreadable. "You were authorized to build, Mercer, not to know. That reactor almost buried half this district." "Containment held," she replied simply. "And now we know it works." Elijah's chest rose and fell once, slow, measured. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen the cost of brilliance twisted beyond recognition. "You did not lose control of Helios," he said, the words deliberate. "You never intended to control it." A distant siren wailed, faint but growing louder, signaling incoming evacuation forces. Outside, crowds would already be gathering, sensing catastrophe without knowing its shape. Inside the chamber, silence expanded like a shadow between every breath. Evan looked at Elijah, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They were inside something larger than sabotage, larger than theft, larger than failure. This was a machine designed for domination, and Elijah had just proven he still knew it better than anyone alive. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, glancing at the cooling core one last time. "This is not over," he said softly. But beneath them, deep in the substructure, the Helios core gave one last, soft tremor. Not failure, not recovery. A signal, one meant for someone else. And far above the city, in a Directorate satellite orbiting the upper stratosphere, a sequence of locked protocols began to wake. Helios was only Phase 1,